For today's project, we are going to be painting a koi fish, and this is a really fun project. I just love painting these because of the interesting colors and markings, and it's a great opportunity to be able to do some wet and wet techniques. So we're going to start out now with just the drawing, and I am using a watercolor pad for this. You can use any artist grade watercolor paper as long as it's 100% cotton. You don't have to use a pad, you can use a block or just a small piece of a sheet of watercolor paper will work perfectly. So the shape of this koi fish reminds me of the capital C right in here. And it's also like a teardrop shape because right in here it's kind of round and much fatter. And then as we come around this curve here, it begins to thin out right in here. And I like to think about the tail fin here as sort of like a triangle. And we just want to go ahead and block this in. And I'm also indicating a little line here and a line back here for where the front fins are going to go. This is another curve. This one's a curve back here. And this one kind of flattens out and curves back in here. And I'm also putting a circle here for this eye and another circle back here for the eye and two little circles for where its nose and its little whiskers go. So now I'm just going to create some little lines here for its back fins all along its backbone, and then there's also another part here. This is one of its other little fins in the back. So I don't want to be too detailed with the drawing, but I just want to make sure that the placement looks good. And you want to also draw really nice and light, and that way if you want to shift things around, it's not too hard to erase it or paint over the top of it. Some of these lines might show through, so when the painting is completely dry you can use one of those white magic erasers and go ahead and erase the lines after the painting is done. So for the first part of this painting, we are going to start laying down some clear water just over here and on the front of its head, because I want to put some patches of red paint, and we're going to do some wet and wet techniques for that. So more water back here. And now I'm going to go ahead and reach for a size 6 brush and take some Scarlet Lake, which is a great red for this project. It's more of an orangey red, and start dropping this in. And you can see how beautiful it is, just the way the water really does do the work for you. It begins to kind of fan those washes out. And keep in mind that we are going to be going ahead and dropping in some other color into this while it's still nice and wet. And I'm also going to put a little bit here on it for its nose. And use some clear water on the edge there of these washes just to make sure I get a nice soft line. Kind of love that blurry effect. That really works for this project. I'm also dropping in just a little bit of alizarin crimson, which happens to be more of a rosy red, and it also has a darker value, because you'll see how nice that is to have two different kinds of reds merging and bleeding together. Back over here some more color. And then I'm using some clear water so this begins to flow down the side of this fish and back around the eye. And I'm doing a technique I call saving whites, and that's where any place where I'm going to come back in and maybe either leave it white or create some other details, we're just painting around that, in this case the eyes and also the nose. And I'm working pretty quickly because I know that these washes are going to dry off, and I also want to add some of my New Gamboge or Indian Yellow, would work really well too. And just while it is still really wet, put in some of that color, because I am seeing with these koi fish that a lot of reds, blacks and yellows in their markings. And you know what's interesting about koi fish? I don't know if you've ever had a chance to go to a koi pond and just watch them, but every one of them is different and unique, and they all have different little spots and markings on them. So it's not, you don't have to worry about getting these markings exact. You can kind of design it the way you want. So up in here, I'm just pulling some of that same color up here because the paint is going to go wherever there's moisture. In this case, we'll take a little bit of our Scarlet Lake and mix it together with alizarin crimson and just begin to dot some of it in here because this little koi fish has spots on him. And back over here. I'm just allowing some of those colors just to bleed and merge together beautifully. Keeping in mind that the front of this fish is kind of like a teardrop, nice and big and fat, and then it begins to thin out as it curves around. So while that's still wet, I'm also going to grab some of my black, and for black I'm using, you can either use a neutral tint or Payne's Grey, and you can see how dark this looks when it's in the well, but when you start adding water to it, it gets more grey and lighter. So we're going to go ahead and just put some markings up in here, and the paint is beginning to dry off a little bit, but it still is not completely dry, so it's still blending really well. And because it's drying off, I'm just taking a little bit of clear water here on my brush and running it along the edge so that it begins to blend and move a little bit more on the paper. Over here this wash is still real wet, so you can see how it moves differently. And what I love about doing these kinds of paintings is they're so much fun. You really can't go wrong with where you put down the washes. It just gives you an opportunity to really learn and explore about how much water to use on your paper and about drying times and how the paint reacts when you're creating wet and wet washes. Wet and wet washes are one of the primary techniques that we use with watercolor. And back over here, this very light passage over here is still wet, so I'm able to take some of this watered down mix of my Payne's Grey or neutral tint, either of those colors works, and just create some little curvy lines. Those are perfect. Okay, so now for this back tail, I'm going to use the same Payne's Grey neutral tint mixture, either of those colors, and water it down so it turns into a nice soft grey. And this is what we're going to use to build up the tail. So you can see now that we're using a size 6 brush and just painting some little lines, curvy lines, because I want to kind of create that flowing look with that back tail, like as though he's actually swimming. And I'm going to take some of my paper towel and show you what happens if you happen to create something that's not quite what you want. I'm just using the tip of my brush with clear water, and I could actually leave that, it looks fine, or just take a little bit of paper towel and just blot it out. So once again, creating that wash, and this means that this is very light, so we're going to come back and paint back into it some darker lines in just a minute. We just want to get that first layer down. And then I'm going to come back over here and I want to create a little bit of a shadow on the side of this fish so that it looks a little bit more three-dimensional, and we're going to do that using the same mix of Payne's Grey, and all we have to do is just paint in a little bit of that grey on the side. Just run that up there and it kind of gives it more volume. And now I'm going to take some Payne's Grey here, neutral tint, and I'm giving you those options because they on the listed colors for this class you have a choice between either Payne's Grey or neutral tint for for your darkest dark. And it's a very similar color. And I happen to be using Payne's Grey today on my palette. So over here I also created one of these little front fins using a very watered down mix of Payne's Grey, and I'm going to make another one over here because we are going to come back in and create some darker lines just to give it a little bit more variety of value. And so these really show up, and they're just little curvy lines, and I like to do the curves because it really shows like this guy is swimming through water. Just using little long strokes, little dashes. The other place where you can use this same wash is along his back. And these are just quick little strokes. You do them very fast, and you start out with the tip of your brush and just push that paint up using that very light wash. Okay, this wash in here on the back part of the fish is still very wet, so I'm going to take my paper towel and I want to create some spots. So I'm going to push into the paper, lift up, and you can see how that begins to remove pigment. And this works only when the paint is really still wet. And you can see over in where the eyes are, where I kind of left a white space. This is a great opportunity now to start painting in the eyes. And we're going to start with very light wash of the Payne's Grey. And this is the shape that I'm using is a capital C. You can see that's just a curve. And back over here, just doing that first layer, but I'm leaving a little highlight because we're going to come back in and go a little bit darker over the top. So at this stage, what I'm wanting is these washes to completely dry off, but I can do a couple of lines while it's still pretty wet. Just little dashes to kind of build up the values. And you can see how putting a little bit of a darker wash, this is called layering when we come back over the top, does start to add some real definition, but it's because the washes are so nice and light, it's very subtle. And then we'll come back with that third layer when it's completely dry. And for the eyes, I'm going to come back in here and start laying in another little curve of darker value. This time we're going a little bit darker than we were before because we want to start putting in the definition. The eyes are so important when you're painting animals or people because your eye is always drawn to the eyes. And it really brings sort of a statement, and it brings character to your painting, so they are very important. So there's a little broken line around the perimeter, and also I'm going to do two little round circles right here just for the front of the nose, and then this here, little whiskers. I guess that's what these guys have, is little whiskers on them. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and let this dry for maybe 10 minutes and come back in, and we'll just do a couple more finishing touches of layering on the tails and the fins, and then we'll be finished. Okay, so next stage now is just to finish up the fins, and we've allowed all of this to dry. So we're going to use two colors for this. We're going to use Payne's Grey or neutral tint, either one of those, and ultramarine blue. So I'm actually going to put a little puddle of this to the side so we can work with those two colors. And for this fin over here, I'm just going to pre-wet it a little bit in some areas and take some Payne's Grey and begin to go a little bit darker with the wash. When you go darker, it always means less water and more paint. And some of these I'm just going to paint directly on the dry paper, and some of these I'm going to paint into the wet, so you get two different kinds of strokes. And you can use clear water, or whenever you paint on the dry stroke, you can use clear water on the edge to soften it just a wee bit. Right in here. So we're just starting to build up a little bit more volume, and then also adding some blue in there, some of the ultramarine blue to the grey as well. Just change up things a little bit. And those two colours will kind of blend and merge with the grey. You can see that. And this is, I'm actually going to pull back some of that colour. It was a little bit strong. And you can do that when you wipe your brush off on a paper towel and you have a dry brush that doesn't have any moisture in it. You can just go ahead and push that brush into the surface of the paper and it will lift out some of that wash. Okay, and we come back here, mix up some Payne's Grey with water, going a little bit darker than we did before, and then creating some little dashes and curvy lines. Same thing for these little edges here on the back of the fish. Over here, just building it up. So we're coming to a finishing place with this fish. So we're just adding that second layer for more detail. And notice how I'm using little broken lines. That helps things look not so rigid, a little bit more expressive, but it gives us the idea that there's little ridges on his tail. And then, once again, any places where I feel like there's too many lines, I'll just kind of use some clear water just to soften a few edges there. And now I'm going to take some of the creamy paint from the paint well, that's pretty dark, and right where the pupil is, or the center of that fish eye, I want it to be really dark, right in there. And that just gives us more of a focal point because we have darker paint. And just using the real tip of the brush, some of that dark mix, I'm painting right into the wet and wet to get some more definition on some of those lines on the edge of those fins. Maybe a couple in here. No, you don't have to do it on every one, but just in a few key places, adding a little bit of a darker wash and letting it kind of bleed into the underwashes. Same thing in here. We're almost finished. And you'll notice how sometimes I'll put down a wet wash, and when that wash is still really wet, I'll come back in with some more paint. And that is a wet and wet technique. So, and now I'm going to go ahead and grab my smallest brush, which is a number 1, and take up some of this Payne's Grey and just touch around here, and then paint around the perimeter of the eye just so that it stands out, and also here another little whisker. So I'm just going to look at this just for a minute and see if there's anything else that I could add to it, because it's actually finished. So I think I'm going to add another little curve coming back the other way. Okay, so I would say that this is finished and it doesn't need anything else except for me to go ahead and sign right here. And then we're finished.